Thank you very much. So, changing track from type 2 diabetes and novel insulins to management of patients with hypoglycemia unawareness, impaired awareness of hypoglycemia. And this is particularly my area of interest. I run a specialist hypoglycemia service at King's College Hospital, and more than half of the patients I see have had multiple episodes of severe hypoglycemia with unconsciousness. And so a typical patient is someone like this guy. He's a 48-year-old male who's had type 1 diabetes for 32 years. He has completed our carbohydrate counting education program called Daphne 9 years ago. For 9 years, he has been on a pump. But for the last 10 years, he has had recurrent severe hypos. In the last year, 12 months, he has had more than 50 glucagon injections because of unconsciousness. Now, this 48-year-old man is unable to be alone. At all time, his family or children are with him because they are scared someone has to be there to give him glucagon. He can't work. He feels he is a burden to family and to society. His doctor said, to avoid hypos, we will run your sugar levels high. So now he has retinopathy treated with laser. He is eating to avoid hypoglycemia. He is unable to exercise, so he is now overweight and depressed. He has been seeing the local nurse every 3 to 4 weeks and tried very different things. So this is the average patient I see, and that is because in your practice you might have 1 or 2 patients like this, and they all get referred in to me. So I want to go through a stepwise approach of how to deal with this sort of person. So the first point is always to quantify the problem. We have a saying, what you don't measure, you can't change. Yep. The second step is to identify the cause, and in my experience, the cause divides into 3 main categories. You rarely have secondary causes, but you've got to exclude them. Most patients have a problem with therapy setup, and I'll talk about what I mean by that. And then for half of the problem patients, it is a problem with behavior, not the dosing. And so I'll go through each of those steps separately. Secondary causes, we'll be looking at different endocrine causes, very rare to find them. Therapy setup is basal bolus split, the dose of insulin, and behavior could be things like exercise, alcohol, self-care, and fear, not of hypoglycemia, but fear of complications, fear of high glucose. So the first point is to quantify the problem. And I ask a number of different questions to these patients, because for those hypo-unaware patients, usually they underestimate their problem. Right? So I would ask them firstly, how many times have you needed an emergency medical support or hospital admission? How many times do your friend and family say, have some sugar, you're not right? How many times have you been unconscious, loss of consciousness? And then these patients who are hypo-unaware often surround themselves with people who recognize when they're going low and give them treatment so they don't have the severe hypo. And it's important to try and capture how often that is happening. So in a week, how many times does your partner, child, worker give you glucose because you're hypo? On a quantifiable basis, we look at their blood glucose meter download, and I ask, how many times do you have a reading less than 4? What is your time in range or time in hypoglycemia if they're using continuous monitor? And this is an important question. Do other people recognize hypoglycemia before you do? Now, what are the standard scorings for hypoglycemia is something called the GOLD score, which is a very simple question. Please indicate when can you recognize when your hypoglycemia is starting. 1 means always, and 7 means never. And so, if the patient circles 1 or 2, it means they have good awareness. If they circle 4 or 5, it means they have impaired awareness. And if they score 6 and 7, it is complete unawareness. And you can see from these data from my clinic that as the GOLD score goes from, so GOLD was the name of the doctor who came up with the score in Scotland, in Edinburgh. If the score goes from 1 or 2, your risk of severe hypoglycemia is 5 to 7%. If the score is 6 or 7, it is 50% of patients are having multiple severe hypos. It's quite strange that even with complete loss of awareness, 50% have no severe hypos. And often it is because they're surrounded by people who protect them. Now, actually, defining a severe hypo is very difficult. In England, this is important because if you have 2 severe hypos needing third-party help, you lose your driving license. So I want to ask you, this was a young girl, a young woman, who came to my clinic. She was a 27-year-old lady working in a banking industry. She had been at a party, and about 1 o'clock in the morning, came home. She says she hadn't drunk more than usual, but maybe a little bit. She managed to get home, but her flatmate said she was incoherent, she was uncoordinated, unbalanced. She was saying some words confused. So her flatmate called the ambulance, who came. In the meantime, the flatmate gave her some orange juice, and she eventually recovered. When the paramedics came, they measured the glucose. It was 2.4, 2.5. She was conscious but confused. The glucose recovered without any glucagon. And after 30 minutes, the paramedics went home. So I want you to put your hand up if you think, this is a severe hypo. So 20%. The other 80% think this is not a severe hypo. Now, I've asked this question in about 30 different countries. Same slide. And I've had a response from between 90% saying this is severe hypo to 5%. And I think it's really interesting when we think about clinical studies where severe hypoglycemia is the outcome, where we think about our clinical practice. If this patient comes to your practice and you thought it was a severe hypo, she might get a different treatment, pump or sensor. And if she goes to your practice, you didn't think it was a hypo, we'll carry on. So it's sometimes you have to ask a lot of detail to define a severe hypo. So now, who is at risk of severe hypo? What these data show is that as you go from 10 years of diabetes to 30 years of diabetes, even though the number of readings below 4 biochemical hypoglycemia is 2 episodes per week, the same, the risk of severe hypoglycemia increases. So the long duration patients have the same number of hypo events, but have more severe hypoglycemia. And if you look at the data, about 60 to 70% have 0 severe hypos, 10% have 1 or 2 severe hypos, and then there's a small group here, 5% of patients who are responsible for 50% of the severe hypos. If you speak to ambulance crews, they know when you get a call to that address, it's the type 1 who's having recurrent severe hypos, because they go to his house or her house every 2 weeks. So those are the people I'm going to focus a bit more on. Now, we all hear in lots of papers that if you improve HbA1c, you get an increased risk of severe hypoglycemia. And that was what DCCT told us, right? But it's not true. It's not true, because the DCCT was a treat to target study. We treat to hypoglycemia. These are data from the Type 1 Diabetes Exchange, which are an American registry of 20,000 patients. And the rate of severe hypoglycemia is the same across all the different HbA1c. Why? These people who achieve very, very low HbA1c are usually a bit over-insulinized. But they measure a lot, and they catch the hypo before it happens. But occasionally, some hypos slip through. These people, at 7%, have the right balance between insulin requirement and how much insulin they take. These people, at A1C 9 and 10%, don't take enough insulin, or they don't take it at the right time. So they run high readings. Every now and again, they get annoyed, they take a dose, and they have a hypo. And I'll show you exactly what happens in those a bit later. The other important point to make is that increasingly we are using Libre or CGM to look at hypoglycemia. And I think Dr. Peshkova was saying that when you wear the Libre, you must find that you are also hypoglycemic. Yeah? So sensors overestimate hypoglycemia. In this study, they took people who were hypo-aware and hypo-unaware, and the aware patients only recognized 40% of the hypos on CGM. This does not mean that they are unaware. It means that 60 to 80% of sensor hypos are silent. We cannot define awareness of hypoglycemia based on CGM. However, time below 4 does predict the risk of severe hypoglycemia, but does not predict hypo-unawareness. And this is an area we need to investigate a bit further, but don't make the mistake of seeing lots of CGM lows and saying your patient has impaired awareness. So, using the questions, looking at downloads, using CGM, we can quantify the problem. The next step to deciding what the correct treatment is identifying the cause. So I have a hypo panel of blood tests that I do, which is kidney and liver function, thyroid function, cortisol, growth factor, IGF-1, insulin antibodies, check for lipohypertrophy. Yeah. In 15 years of looking at recurrent severe hypo, I've found 2 patients with isolated growth hormone deficiency out of 300. I have never found undiagnosed Addison's or undiagnosed celiac yet. But if you don't look, you don't find. So low yield, but you should do these tests. Oops. The second bit is therapy setup. So normally, when someone comes to clinic with problematic hypos, my strategy is to do a hard reset. Control, Alt, Delete, and start again. Let me explain. So, a common theme when the patients are in clinic is, if you have lots of hypos, then the doctor or nurse looking after them will reduce the dose of insulin. Yeah? Or the patient who is too scared will reduce the dose of insulin. So what will happen if you have not enough insulin? High reading. When you get the high reading, now what will the patient do? Correction dose, which is insulin without food. That then causes the hypo. The patient then eats, sugar goes up, then the patient takes insulin again. And this actually is the main cause of extreme glycemic variability, which is food here and insulin here. When your food and insulin are in different time zones, you have variability. The way to reduce the variability is not to change the dose or the insulin, it's to get them back in the correct time zone, with insulin 15 minutes before the food. Okay? So this is a common mistake I see from other clinicians, is that they reduce the dose and that increases the risk of hypoglycemia. When I talk about therapy setup, I will direct you to this document which we wrote, which was best practice guide to insulin pump use. But I follow, when I said I do Control Alt Delete, I look at the total daily dose and I split it 50-50 between basal and bolus. For my carb ratio, insulin to carbohydrate ratio, I use 350 divided by total daily dose, and for the insulin sensitivity factor, 130 divided by total daily dose. So whatever the patient's other therapy is, my logic is using the same doses and expecting a different result is stupidity. I'm going to start again as if you're a new diabetic. And I use these rules. and I have done with a lot of success. So let me show you the example of that guy I showed in the first slide. He was doing 3.6 tests per day. He had extreme variability, right? He was obese. He was on 100 units of insulin per day, but 35% was basal and 65% was bolus. Why? Because he had hypo, his team had reduced the basal. So he had more high readings, he did more corrections. That's why his bolus was high. And when you have an imbalance between basal and bolus, you have high variability. So, we did a Control-Alt-Delete. He was on 100 units per day, so my predicted basal is 50 units. Divide that by 24 hours, 2 units per hour. Simple? So if you're on injections, that would have been 50 units of Toujeo, or whichever insulin you want to use. Total daily dose was 100, so its carb ratio 3.5. You can see here the carb ratio was too low, 5.8. So the doctors were reducing the ratio, making things worse. I reset him to the right ratio. I reset the sensitivity to 1.2. It was, again, too soft. 3 months later, what is the result? I think you can see. Much less variability, no hypoglycemia. Now, actually, of course, he's also got a sensor. And we gave him a sensor because he was very high risk. But actually, he didn't need it. If we reset the insulin, we time the insulin before the food to stop the post-meal spikes, we got a much better control. So I was very lucky to be involved in a group of clinicians who looked at all the papers that talked about restoration of awareness. And when we reviewed all the evidence from all the papers that we could find, we came up with this 4-step approach. The most cost-effective and simple way to reduce hypoglycemia is to teach your patient to carbohydrate count and to adjust the insulin for exercise and other activities. That can reduce hypoglycemia by 50%. If that doesn't work, 3 months later you still have hypos, the next step is pump therapy, which over the last 40 years has shown a 4-fold reduction in severe hypos. Actually, now we often go to CGM first. In my practice, if someone has had recurrent severe hypos, rather than pump, we go for a CGM like Dexcom first. If they still have hypos, we combine sensor, augmented, pump, sensor and pump with suspend theory. And if that doesn't work, then we are lucky to have the option of islet cell transplantation. So we wrote a meta-analysis paper of all the education programs that reduced hypoglycemia. The average effect size was 50% reduction in hypos with education. The common theme was this was 20 to 30 hours over 1 to 5 weeks. If you did less time, you got less benefit. And the key factors were carbohydrate counting, dose adjustment, reflection, which is looking at your data, and the management of hypos, exercise, and alcohol. These are all the curriculum of the education programs. This is a meta-analysis of pump therapy, all the studies, showing a 4 times reduction in hypoglycemia. And these are data from CGM showing a 50% reduction in severe hypo and reduction also in medical intervention. I was involved with a Medtronic-funded study of low glucose suspend in high-risk patients, which I presented in Berlin earlier this year. And if you use the Medtronic 640G system, we had an 84% reduction in severe hypos. The rate in these hypo-unaware patients was below the background rate of hypoglycemia in aware patients using this technology. And as you can see, sensor and pump alone, you have the hypo rate. If you add in VO, which is suspend, you halve it. If you add in 640G, it halves further. I think tomorrow, Professor Battaglino is going to talk about closed loop. Again, using closed loop, we can, by varying the insulin, we can reduce the variation in glucose and avoid hypoglycemia. In some patients, you have done the education, you have used pump and sensor, but you're still having hypoglycemia. Luckily, in those patients, we are one of the few centers in the world that can offer islet transplantation. And you can see here, just 2 weeks after the transplant, even though the patient is still on 17 units per day, the profile is almost the same as a non-diabetic person. 4 months later, this person is off insulin, and now has been off insulin for the last 4 years. Now, sometimes though, technology isn't always the answer. And this is a particular area of our research. This was a 55-year-old lady who had long-standing type 1 diabetes with very low HbA1c and very much lots of hypoglycemia. 30% of the time was hypoglycemia, recurrent hospital admissions. We treated her with the latest technology and Control-Alt-Delete, and she got better. I was seeing her every 2 weeks for 3 months to get her here. We thought we have solved the problem. I said, now you can come in 3 months. Can you see the problem here? She has increased the insulin. She turns the sensor off at night because it is alarming the whole night and keeping her husband awake. Yeah. So all the work we had done had disappeared. Why? This patient enjoys hypoglycemia. I can see some people nodding. You might have some of these patients in your clinic as well. So we have done a lot of research around the behavior and psychology of this group of people. They seem to place a disproportionate, too much emphasis on avoiding high glucose. They were told 30 years ago that if you have a glucose more than 8, you will go blind. They've had the severe hypo and survived it. It doesn't cause them a problem. They prefer to have the severe hypo than the risk of going blind. So what we do is put these people in the MRI scanner make them hypo, and see what happens to their brain. And the top is the pattern of brain activation in a hypo-aware patient, and the bottom is the pattern in a hypo-unaware patient. And what we find is, this is the thalamus, hypothalamus, this is the stress response. This frontal activation is the emotional response to that stress. How important that stress is to them. You can see much less thalamus response in the unawares, and again, less frontal response as well. And what this means is that the hypo-aware patient thinks hypoglycemia is stressful. It's unpleasant. It is unrewarding. And they lay down an emotional, this unpleasant emotional memory of this event, which provides internal motivation to not have another hypo. It generates fear of hypo. In the hypo-unaware patient, it is not stressful. They don't have the stress response. In fact, in some patients, we see an activation in pleasure response, in fun from hypoglycemia. And I think most importantly, this frontal memory, the emotional response to hypoglycemia, negative emotional response, does not happen. So when they come to you and you adjust the insulin to avoid hypo, they don't understand it. Why are you changing insulin? I'm going to run high. I'm scared of that. So they don't make the change. That's what happened in my lady. And the way I think about it is, if I asked you to jump out of an aeroplane with some nylon on your back, you will have the same stress response that a person has from hypoglycemia. Thalamus, adrenaline, sweats, shakes. But your emotional response to that stress can be either, I enjoyed that, I survived that, it is not a problem, I might even like to have some more. Or, that was so scary, I'm never going near an aeroplane again. Yeah? So this is same stress, but the emotional response causes extreme fear of hypoglycemia, or fear of complications and lack of fear of hypoglycemia. And so this problem, just like this problem, is not addressed by education or technology. A psychological problem needs a psychological solution. And certainly we identified three specific thought processes that these people have. And the most common thought process is what we call an overactive smoke alarm. Which means that if they see a slightly high sugar reading, they take double the dose just to be sure that it goes down. And they don't mind if there's a hypo. The second response is we call soldiering on. So even though they know they're going hypo, they delay treatment from when they can treat it until they become too confused. So delaying treatment, soldiering on, not treating the hypo. And the third thing is head in the sand, ostrich. Which is, I know I'm going to be hypo, but if I check, then I'm going to have to stop, take the glucose. It's going to stop my work. If I don't check, maybe the hypo will go away. And so we have designed a CBT, a behavioral treatment that addresses these thinking traps that we are testing in a RCT at the moment. So in summary, treating someone with recurrent severe hypo, you need to think about their psychology. We need to make sure they have the right education around carbohydrate counting. If required, they might need some technology. In severe cases, where available, even transplantation. But broadly, again, think of those 3 steps. Quantify the problem so you can assess whether your treatment has made a benefit. Establish the cause. Rule out secondary causes. Set up the therapy. Investigate behavioral treatments. Once you've found the cause, you can then select the right treatment from this algorithm. Thank you.